a few years ago when I was living in New York. It was not long after I'd gotten married to Sarah. And one of the important things with a married couple is you meet each other's friends and often their spouses. So we're at a kosher restaurant. We're meeting one of Sarah's friends who was just absolutely lovely. And I don't know if it's her husband or her fiance came to meet us, and he was very gracious and everything like that. And they were an Orthodox couple as well, but they were more there are different words for whether to the right, more, small c conservative. He wore the fedora, the black hat, and everything like that. And he was extremely well educated. I think he was a medical doctor, probably still is. But somehow we got into the conversation. I don't know who brought it up about sending kids, and both of us were a long way from having kids, sending kids to college. And for Sarah and I, who had both gone to university, our parents had gone to university, it was a no brainer. Of course, you go to college. It's an important part of your development, getting a liberal education on top of the Torah education. For me, I went to private schools my whole life, so there was just as much Torah education as secular history, math, science, literature, etc. Sarah had started that later in her life, but still, we both valued college as well as Torah education. But this man was completely opposed to it. Thought he would never send his kids there. And what started out as an open conversation eventually just turned into two men who were all but trying to beat each other up to show off for our wives. But the debate that we were having is a real one that is had in the Jewish world. And apart from two men trying to one up each other, tonight we're actually going to talk about, is there an issue within Jewish law or Jewish philosophy? Because tonight we're going to touch on both topics. We're going to lean more into the philosophy, a way of life, more than legally whether it's permitted or not. But the question is, how does Judaism view, and there's two parts to this, secular education in general, meaning topics that are not explicitly Jewish, and then in general, going off to university and what are the issues there. Now, there's one topic that we're not going to touch on tonight as much, and it's one that a lot of people bring up, which is that and it's specifically for observant Jews, although in many ways it apply to all Jews, is there's a concern that a young observant male or female goes to college, they're going to not be observant anymore. There's even a phrase for it, off the derech, or OTD. You ever see that in the Jewish publication, OTD? It's off the derech, i.e. off the path, no longer observant. They're concerned they'll stop keeping kosher, they'll stop keeping Shabbat, they'll do other things. And there's certain truth to the fact that at college, people experiment, they do things, that they wouldn't do in their parents' home. But in terms of whether or not that's a real concern, there's not really, hard evidence one way or the other. There are plenty of kids who have gone to college and they stopped being observant. But I went to college and I became more observant. So if a parent's concerned their child has stopped keeping kosher, send them to a college with kosher food. At the end of the day, it's not really about the college, it's about the student and the way they were raised. Now, obviously, someone who's in a completely cloistered environment, who's never developed any skills to be able to function in the real world and to make proper decisions, yeah, college will be more challenging. But that's less an indictment of college than of parents who choose to completely shelter their children, which obviously there's a debate about that. But the topic tonight is not whether or not it's possible to be observant at college, and not whether college will make somebody not observant. Again, there's no one way for that. It really depends on the kid and the way they were raised. The question here is more about just the value of a secular education at all, again, in general and specifically college. So the first place that we're going to start is more theoretical. And it's not about secular education, but it's about how our tradition views Torah and the value of Torah learning. And it's not enough to just say, well, the Torah is awesome, because the way that it is viewed through the classic sources, and the pedestal upon which is put, becomes the key part of our conversation. If Torah is so central, is there room for anything else? So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And then the first quote here is from the Mishnah, the section Pirkei Avot, and it's just a very short, sweet Mishnah. And I'll explain it, Gloria, after you read it. But it captures the central idea of how Torah education and everything specifically explicitly Jewish is viewed within our tradition. So please, Gloria.
Ben Bagbag said, "Turn it over, and again turn it over, for all is therein, and look into it, and become gray and old therein, and do not move away from it, for you have no better portion than it."
Excellent. So Ben Baba here is talking about the Torah and all of the associated rabbinic writings and just Jewish writings, whether they be legal, ethical, entertainment, whatever it is. But the point here is that within the corpus of Torah knowledge, everything is in there. If someone says, I want to learn philosophy, you don't need to go to Aristotle, it's in the Torah. Someone says, I want to learn science or even math, there are rabbis that have written about that. Now, where they learned that from was not within the Torah, but regardless, the claim here is that everything that is important for life, and that's very key, everything that one needs to know for a quality life can be found within the corpus of Torah. Again, not just literally the 5 books of Moses, but everything, the Talmud, the commentaries on it, just everything written by the rabbis, Hebrew, English, French, it doesn't matter. You don't need to go to any secular book. You don't need to walk to a Barnes and Noble to learn anything. You can walk into any Sfarim store and everything you need to know will be there. Now that idea is going to be expanded upon in this next piece. So Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, who we've used a lot of his works before, wrote this series, or is writing the series continuing on Jewish law. And one of his sections covers, various topics. One of them is the value of learning Torah. And in the 14th chapter of this section, he talks about the centrality of Torah and how it's seen and how it's unique and different from secular wisdom. So Gloria, I'll have you take this as well. And one thing I'll say is in the translation here, there's a couple of different words throughout this class that are used for different kinds of knowledge. They often use the word chokhmah from wisdom, but then they use the word limud for learning. So the translations here are somewhat interchangeable, but the basic difference that hopefully is reflected is Jewish wisdom knowledge versus secular wisdom and knowledge. So again, as long as that distinction comes out, then the other details aren't as important. Like, for example, in the first sentence, it says wisdom of the natural world. Just means secular education as opposed to Torah education. So Gloria, please, Torah is not.
Torah is not like the wisdom of the natural world, where it is possible to understand it, secular wisdom, without any spiritual preparation, whereas the Torah is the word of God, and therefore, without the appropriate preparation, it's not possible to comprehend the Torah in one's heart and mind. These preparations represent good character traits. A person who does not improve their character will not be able to understand God's Torah. These good character traits are the basis upon which Israel were chosen from amongst all the nations to receive the Torah. This is what the sages said about Israel's character traits. There are 3 distinguishing marks of this nation, the Jewish people. They are merciful, they are shamefaced, understood as awe of heaven, and they perform acts of kindness.
Pause there for a moment. So this first section here, and again, Rabbi Melamed is bringing together kind of a synthesis of hundreds, if not thousands of years of different opinions going all the way back from the Talmud. But here he's not disparaging secular education. What he's pointing out is that Torah education is the highest, for at least for Jews, the highest level of understanding they can achieve. But he also says it's not something that you just pick up a book and you read it. It requires someone to actually be in a certain spiritual place for them to be a certain kind of person. So it's not just about intellectual pursuits here. It's about the quality of your ethics, your morality, the way you treat other people. So Torah is different and more complex than secular education. So when one comprehends it and masters Torah, it's not just that they're learning for the sake of learning, they're becoming a better human being. But again, that in no way disparages or even it lowers secular education. It just says Torah education is unique, it's a challenge, and it's great. But now he continues on, not disparaging secular education, but kind of, putting things in comparison. So Gloria, please.
Also, one who sinks themselves into materialism or the pursuit of wealth is not able to raise himself up and to connect to God's Torah. Therefore, one who desires to grow in Torah and to be crowned in the crown of Torah will not distract himself with other matters or be drawn after base desires, and won't seek to acquire the wisdom of Torah along with wealth and fame, honor. Rather, one should sanctify, devote his life to Torah, and even if it leads to a poor life where one eats only bread with salt, a little water, and to sleep on the ground, one should continue to toil in Torah, because only one who is willing to sacrifice oneself with all his or her might for the sake of learning Torah will he or she be able to deserve merit it.
Excellent, thank you. So again, here, it's not disparaging, and in fact, it's not really talking about secular education at all. That's the premise with which he began. But here he's talking about how Torah is the most important thing above all else. And someone should not do any, they should give up everything. You know, if the option is learn Torah and be poor, or don't learn Torah and be rich, the option would be choose to be poor. Ideally, one would be supported in Torah, and that's a whole debate about supporting Torah scholars. But again, the takeaway here is not that secular education is bad. It's that anything that distracts from learning Torah should be pushed aside, because the ultimate goal in life for a Jew, male or female, is to pursue a life of Torah, both in deed and in study. So if we were to end there, we could say, well, that's beautiful. It's pretty consistent with a lot of the ideas that we kind of share about the value of God's word of Torah. And also, there's no room for anything else. So it's not that secular education is bad, and that's an important thing, we'll come back to it. Not that secular education is bad, rather there's just no room to learn anything else. So end of story. It's not that there's no value in secular education, rather there's just no room for it, because Torah should be above all. Any questions up until now? Excellent. So Leonard, the next piece here is very interesting. It continues. It's the next chapter in Rabbi's Melamed's Peninei Halacha, and he's actually kind of bring us like full circle, like give us the whole big picture, and then we'll step back and look at some different opinions and the development of the relationship between Jews and secular education. But one of the things that he's going to say here is so interesting is we're assuming when we say Torah knowledge, we're only talking about things that you can buy in a Jewish farm store that are published by ArtScroll or Koren Publishers or Feldheim, etc. But maybe the word Torah and the idea of pursuing Torah knowledge means something bigger than just books of Jewish law. So Leonard, on here, Peninei Halacha, the difference between, please.
The difference between Torah and secular knowledge is that secular knowledge is fundamentally a means to an end. For example, the value in learning physics or electronics is in order to use the scientific fruits to improve the quality of the life of man. Therefore, we don't need each and every person to specialize in the sciences. Rather, we need just enough scientists to be able to improve and enhance scientific knowledge. But Torah knowledge is an end in and of itself. Through the Torah and its way of life, one improves oneself.
Pause there for a moment. So he's making some interesting statements here. Again, it's not that secular knowledge is bad, but why would you study secular knowledge unless you're using it to achieve something? And one of the things the rabbis talk about a lot, and again, many sources that we're not bringing here is, if you're going to get a secular education, learn to read English, learn math, et cetera, like that, it's only so you can have a job. If you need to be able to provide for your family, so you can buy food for Shabbat, so you can, live a fulfilling Jewish life, obviously you're probably going to need to learn to speak and read English. And even in these ultra-Orthodox Haredi communities, there are many who know basic things about functioning in the world only for the sake of business. But the second they're out of that world, they go back to Yiddish, they go back to Torah learning, which, as we've seen here, is an incredible value because it makes someone, well, there's two parts. One he says here is that Torah makes someone a better human being. It improves the human being, which perhaps he doesn't say it explicitly, but physics doesn't make someone a better human being. Now, I don't know that physics does make someone a better human being. I think it's incredibly valuable for understanding our universe, and we'll come back to that idea. But there is something unique about Torah, and that it adds meaning to the world. It adds, makes life meaningful. It helps guide us. It gives us purpose, makes us, or can, if it's done right, make us better people. But learning, how to conjugate verbs doesn't necessarily do so. So why do we learn handwriting? because it's a skill that's a means to an end. So I don't totally disagree with what he's saying here. But he's also saying that if you don't need a secular education, don't bother getting it, or at least that's kind of implied until he continues on. Go ahead, Leonard, nonetheless.
Nonetheless, after emphasizing that Torah as the highest form of knowledge, is the highest form of knowledge, we need to know that general knowledge of secular studies is also valuable. The Maharal of Prague, in his Nativ HaTorah, chapter 14, explains that general knowledge allows us to uncover the greatness of God in this world, which is to say that scientific knowledge and the wisdom of man are rooted in the wisdom of God. Because God created the world in his wisdom, and general knowledge is rooted in the wisdom of God, which is hidden in this world.
So pause there for a moment, because he's going to get in some very interesting, a fundamental question that really is the core of whether we're allowed to not be in yeshiva studying Talmud and to go out and read Charles Dickens. So if somebody's reading H.G. Wells, fun science fiction. I'm reading that right now, is War of the Worlds, and they read it and say, "This is so cool. This is incredible. What an amazing!" I haven't finished yet. I don't know that's an amazing, inspiring story, but they read, Dickens or Jane Austen, and they say, "This is so powerful emotionally. Such beauty in this world. There's such beauty in this world, and I see it here in this piece of literature." Well, how is it possible for Austen or Dickens or Jules Verne to create such inspiring pieces? Because ultimately they were inspired or given that skill by God. Everything that man, whether it's the James Webb's telescope that's being flown and put together right now in space, such an incredible feat of human engineering, but it's only possible because of God. Then it starts working. We see the universe. What a beautiful, unique, ordered universe, because God created it. So it's not diminishing secular knowledge itself, and it still sees it as a means to an end, but ultimately, all of Torah is that too. Torah itself is ultimately a means to an end to make us better people and connect to God. And secular education can do that too. Science can do it. Math can do it. History, literature, music. They are all tools that can allow us to appreciate the beauty of this world that God created. So whether we're learning it from the Talmud or whether we're learning it from a great piece of literature, everything is ultimately rooted, as it says here, in God's wisdom. Every great scientist, whether they're Jewish or not, and most of them are Jewish anyways, ultimately they are all blessed. Their wisdom comes from God. That's a very unique way of looking at secular education, but what it does is allows for all learning to be valuable. And this class is in many ways part 2 of our class a number of weeks ago on whether books should ever be banned. And I believe it was Rav Kook who said, any book that has some value, even a minimal redeeming value, is worth it, because it has something to teach us about the world. So to say that if there's a book with literally zero value whatsoever, 50 Shades of Grey, there's no value in it whatsoever, don't read that. So if there's a class at the university that literally has zero value whatsoever, okay, don't take that class. But the truth is, virtually everything that universities teach, for not all, but virtually everything, has some way to allow us to appreciate this world. But a key thing for a Jew is to keep in mind that everything they discover that's beautiful or wise, comes back to the wisdom of God. That's key. If we say, wow, Charles Dickens was absolutely brilliant, Shakespeare was so amazing, because God blessed them and gave them that gift. That's the key to make it Jewish. Now, what Rabbi Melamed is going to do here is ask a very fundamental question, which we kind of have the pieces to answer it now, but the way he answers it is so important, because he's going to introduce a fundamental phrase. So Leonard, please continue. One could ask, aren't Jews commanded to learn Torah night and day? And anytime one stops learning Torah to learn secular knowledge, isn't this bitul Torah? That is, nullifying or canceling the study of Torah for the sake of non-worthwhile pursuits. So pause there for a moment. So bitul Torah, from the word levatel, like to cancel or nullify something, whether it's canceling a transaction or to negate something which is to be done. So there's a mitzvah to learn Torah all the time, or at least within the rabbinic understanding of it. So when I was in yeshiva, if I'm sitting there talking, over a Talmudic subject with my friend, my chavruta, great. But then we start talking about something else, politics, or where we're going for dinner and something like that. And if our Rosh Yeshiva would hear it, he would look up for half a second, less than that, and he would yell, Bittul Torah. And that meant stop talking about silly things and go back to learning Torah. Now, in that time, that was appropriate to say it, but Bittul Torah is this idea that anything that's not learning Torah takes away from it is not worthwhile. So people can make that claim about sports, about science, about listening to music. What are you doing listening to Bob Dylan when you should be listening to a podcast from a rabbi talking about a rabbinic subject? So Rabbi Melamed asks, and many have asked before him, if all you're ever supposed to be doing is learning real deep Torah subjects, Mishnah, commentaries on the Torah, well, going off and reading a book about the human immune system on my reading list would be Bittul Torah. And it would be it wouldn't necessarily be forbidden, but it would be not fulfilling a mitzvah. It would be negating a mitzvah, and that's not good. So he continues, rather,
one who engages in the study of wisdom is not considered one who is mevatel Torah.
So he says, nope, if you're learning stuff that's secular education, it's fine. So how does he prove that? Please continue.
Proof for this is brought by the Maharal of Prague from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Sorry, there's an N missing there. It's Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Yochanan ben Zakkai, about whom it is said that he was never a Bital Torah all the days of his life, yet he engaged in the study of astronomy, Sukkah 28a. And as to the decree of the sages that one not study Greek wisdom, it has already been explained by the Rivash and the Maharal that the intention of these decrees, or of this decree, is regarding the manners and culture of the Greeks, whereas their wisdom is not forbidden.
So pause there for a moment. So what's interesting here is the proof, and this goes all the way back to the Talmud, doesn't necessarily explain why secular education is okay. This is an interesting thing that we saw many, many months ago in the class about zoos. No one ever explained why seeing animals in a zoo is permitted. It was just said that some great rabbis went to zoos and never said it wasn't okay. So they must have had their reasons, even if they didn't say it. So too, these rabbis studied secular studies, astronomy. And when it says astronomy in the Talmud, it may have been more astrology, but even though that's not a science, for them it was. It was considered a kind of secular wisdom, but they did it. And no one ever said, and they didn't say it was a problem. No one ever said they did anything wrong. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is one of the most important rabbis in the history of rabbinic wisdom in the development of our religion. And he studied astronomy, so it must be okay. Now, again, it doesn't give the reason for it. The reason might be what Rabbi Melamed said earlier, which is that all knowledge allows us to understand the world which God gave us and to appreciate God's beauty. Rambam in his Mishnah Torah says that pretty explicitly. If you want to understand God, go out and study nature, study philosophy, not just Jewish. Anything to understand the world allows you to understand the mind of God. That's what mysticism does. Eventually, a rabbi will take secular knowledge and turn it into a Jewish book, but all of that comes from secular knowledge to understand the mind and the universe of God. But explicitly, in terms of whether it's permitted to study secular knowledge, we don't have an explicit reason for it, except great rabbis did it, so it must have been okay. And then the next example he brings is, again, one of the greatest rabbis of, I believe, the 18th or 19th century, the Vilna Gaon from Lithuania. And Gaon just means genius. His name was, I believe, Eliyahu. And he's very explicit in his connection to secular education. Leonard, please. And it was popularly known.
And it was popularly known that the Vilna Gaon encouraged his students to learn secular studies, and he encouraged Rabbi Baruch of Shlav to translate Euclid from the Greek to Hebrew so that his students could study geometry. He said to him that one who is lacking knowledge in one area of wisdom is lacking in 100 portions of the wisdom of Torah, because Torah and secular wisdom are intertwined with each other.
that couldn't be, I couldn't have said it better myself. That is so beautiful the way that he says that. And for example, I've given classes on how we access understanding the Torah. And if we just use classical commentaries, which are key, we're missing something. We also need archaeology or the study of other languages to be able to fully appreciate what the Torah is trying to tell us. We need to learn history to unlock all of its secrets. But if we say anything that's not explicitly part of the Talmud, we ignore, then we're literally cutting off our hands and limiting ourselves to understanding the richness of this world that God created for us. So the Vilna Gaon said anything that can enrich that is valuable. Now, again, so far, no one has said, what's between the lines is if there's an area of study that just doesn't enhance one's life at all, it doesn't make them a better person, it doesn't allow them to understand the world. And I can't think of an example of that, of a class that's just totally pointless. No rabbi would support that. But what we've really seen here pretty explicitly, both in Rabbi Melamed and in all the classic sources he brings, is that from the Talmud on for hundreds and hundreds of years, including some contemporary rabbis, secular education is great. At the very least, as a supplement to Torah education, even though Torah education is more important for Jews, it's our unique gift from God. But regardless of that, there is a place for a secular education, and it absolutely can and should be studied. Beautiful. So before we go on, any questions up until now? Great. So the next section here is really cool because Rabbi Melamed in his piece starts to talk about a shift in the medieval period, like the 8th, 9th, 10th century onwards, the times of the rabbis known as the Rishonim. These would be Rashi, Rambam, Ramban, etc., like that. And they started to write pieces that were quite opposed to secular education. Not those rabbis specifically, but rabbis of the medieval period were saying that secular education and secular books in general should not be studied. Why? So Rabbi Melamed says that the reason that medieval rabbis were opposed to secular education was about all of the books, all of the secular books had a very specific type of philosophy, all going back to one specific Greek philosopher, Aristotle. And when I Googled around it, I found this academic work online that talks explicitly about the rise of Aristotle in the medieval world that matches up exactly with what Rabbi Melamed said. And it's reflected perfectly in the rabbinic writings that are opposed to secular education at that time. Whereas for 1,000 years, the rabbi said, secular education is great. Learn other languages, learn astronomy, it's valuable. It'll help you be a better judge, a better rabbi, etc. All of a sudden, stay away from the universities, from secular books. So Tamar, if you could read this piece, please, from this really just great online article. It's actually basically a book, The Rise of Universities and the Discovery of Aristotle, please.
The big new idea of high medieval academia were Aristotle's. The Romans seemed never to have bothered to translate his work into Latin. For this reason, Aristotle remains almost completely unknown to medieval European scholars until Latin translations from Arabic version of his texts began to filter across the border from Spain in the 12th century. Aristotle's thought transformed the medieval intellectual world. His was a comprehensive philosophical system of enormous persuasive and explanatory power. Through the combination of logic, empiricism, and basic principles, his system was capable of explaining almost anything. Even better, because Aristotle explained the workings of the cosmos without reference to supernatural power, philosophical naturalism, his thought, for the most part, did not contradict church teaching. There were a few exceptions. Aristotle denied the immortality of the soul, for example, but since as a pagan, he was not expected to be an authority in theological matters, these errors could be ignored. Indeed, it did not take long for Christian scholars to realize that Aristotle's philosophy could provide insight into all aspects of the natural world, even those that impinged upon religion.
Excellent, thank you. So a few notes here. One is Aristotle was absolutely brilliant, but he was wrong about a lot of things. And perhaps Leonard can attest to the fact that many philosophers and scientists for generations until quite recently in the last 100 or 200 years basically accepted what Aristotle taught. And it wasn't until they rejected some of his scientific teachings that they were able to basically bring in modern science. But most people assumed that he was right about everything. And again, he was right about a lot. But what's important here is, absolutely brilliant. But the medieval Eastern European world wasn't familiar with him because they didn't have his works. But they were being translated by the Arabs in the previous centuries. And what's interesting here is we're talking about the 12th century. We know the rabbis started rejecting secular education a little bit earlier in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. Well, those rabbis were not in Europe. Those were the rabbis who were in the Arabic lands. Those rabbis, in the generations of Rambam. Rambam, on the other hand, really accepted Aristotle. Not everything he taught, he embraced him, but many rabbis rejected these works because Aristotle fundamentally was opposed to some key ideas of Judaism, like resurrection of the dead, where the Talmud says anyone who rejects resurrection of the dead is a heretic and has no place in the world to come. So many rabbis in the Spanish, Middle Eastern lands were rejecting him. And then when his works were translated and made it over to Europe, the rabbis, again, were opposed to anything that had Aristotle in it because those works were considered heretical and would lead one to wrong ideas. So it wasn't about secular education per se. It was about all of secular education was through the lens of Aristotle during this time. So for 1,000 years, secular education, again, whatever that means, natural wisdom, natural philosophy, everyone had access to it. And it wasn't specifically religious. And if it was probably Christian and generally believed in the idea of one God. But once Aristotle's brought in, the Jewish rabbis become very uncomfortable with it. And they start not across the board, but there's a lot of opposition to it. But eventually the rabbis kind of get over that. And Aristotle is no longer the only way to access general knowledge. There become books that are non-Aristotle based, university classes that you can take that don't just teach Aristotle's view of the world. But this paragraph here is so key to understand the beginning of why rabbis started to say, don't go to university because you'll learn something there that is fundamentally against what we believe. So any questions up until now? Beautiful. So the next section here is actually, we're going to start getting into relatively contemporary sources. And we're kind of, this section is called Permitted or Not. We're going to start seeing some rabbis ruling on it, but a lot of them are going to sort of start explaining their opinions about why they're opposed to it or not. And what's interesting to see is what ideas are they going to grab onto? Because other than those medieval rabbis who are opposed to secular education because of Aristotle's influence, in general, the tradition in Jewish literature is that secular education is great because it enhances one's ability to understand God. It's not forbidden, it's great. But then things start to shift. So the best place to start is in the Shulchan Aruch, the compilation of Jewish law in the 16th century. And this is specifically the Ashkenazi Rabbi Moshe Isserles. So Elizabeth, if you would please I'll have you take source 1 and 2, but source 1, please.
In any case, it is permitted to occasionally learn secular studies, that is not in a fixed way, as long as one does not learn heretical works.
Excellent, thank you. So a few things here, and again, this is somewhat connected to the class we had a number of weeks ago on forbidden books. If there's a work that is teaching something fundamentally heretical, however we would define that, fine, don't learn that. Fundamentally, secular education is okay. Now, the question is when he says don't do it, he actually says do it be'akrai. Like once in a while, occasionally, like don't do it in a set manner. So to have like a private school where a set part of the curriculum is secular education, the Rama might be opposed to that. And if that's true, you could say that university is verboten, is forbidden. That doesn't mean that you can never learn science. You can never pick up a book and learn it once in a while, but to specifically have a university studies, he seems to be opposed to that. Now, the rabbis are going to go in different directions on this, in kind of two different extremes. It's kind of where the discussion starts, which is secular education is okay. Don't make it your main thing. Torah education is still superior, and nobody thinks that you can study straight up heresy. Again, what do we mean by straight up heresy? But, we're kind of taking a middle ground. So the second source here, and Elizabeth, I'll have you take this as well. This is the founder of the Chabad movement. Before it was Chabad, he was their first rabbi. He was a disciple, ultimately, of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was a student of the Baal Shem Tov. So he was one of the early founders of Hasidism. And he wrote this work that touched on many different areas of mysticism, but also life and Torah and everything. And he actually touches here, not explicitly on college. He's writing in the 18th century, so he probably had an idea of university, but more secular education in general. So Elizabeth, please, likewise.
Likewise, he who occupies himself with the sciences of the nations of the world is included among those who waste their time in profane matters, insofar as the sin of neglecting the Torah is concerned. Unless he employs these sciences as a useful instrument, that is, as a means of more affluent livelihood to be able to serve God, or knows how to apply them in the service of God and his Torah. This is the reason why Maimonides and Nachmanides, of blessed memory, and their adherents engaged in them.
Excellent, thank you. So it's really interesting if you read again between the lines, it sounds like he's saying university and secular education are evil. He doesn't say that. He doesn't besmirch or say anything bad about the science of the nations. He says one who studies it instead of learning Torah is guilty, not of studying secular studies, but of doing this bitul Torah, of not fulfilling the mitzvah, of putting Torah above all. And I agree with that. Torah should be like the most important thing, and we shouldn't nullify it. But as Rabbi Melamed said, and I also agree with, there are many ways to access the Torah. So then he continues on. He says, look, if you're learning at a university for a livelihood, then it's fine, because secular education is not bad in and of itself. So already he's giving an exception. You can go to university to learn a trade. But then he even expands it more and talks about some of these great rabbis, Maimonides, Nachmanides, who were learning philosophy and other sciences. And Nachmanides, Ramban, in his commentary on the Torah, again, his science reflected the science of his day. So some of it is still correct, some of it is very wrong, but that doesn't matter. He was studying science because it helped him unlock the Torah. So the Alter Rebbe, which is his nickname, the eldest of the Rebbes of Chabad, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, would say that if you're learning secular education to be able to enhance your understanding of Torah, then it's also fine if you know how to do that, like Maimonides and Nachmanides did. So, the claim about who knows how to do that correctly, that's a separate conversation. But even this really strict opinion is full of exceptions. And again, if you read between the lines, secular education, science, and literature and art are not bad unless they're replacing Torah education. So he also basically takes kind of the middle view. And again, if you really read it carefully, he actually has a very expansive view of when secular education would be permitted. And then not much later in the 19th century, you have this explosion of rabbis who really start to value university education mixed together with Torah education. This vision of a higher level education where half your day is Torah or 3/4, whatever the breakdown is, but you do have history and science and art mixed in there. And one of the early great proponents of that was Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. And there was other great rabbis, Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer, and they created this Wissenschaft, this kind of Torah education that was mixed with secular studies, and they were all supposed to raise each other up. So in this beautiful book that Rabbi Hirsch wrote, and Lynn, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. He writes here, and I'm just including the English because I didn't want to bust out the German or go seeking for that because I don't speak German. So Lynn, please, the more indeed.
More indeed, Judaism comprises the whole of man and extends its declared mission to the salvation of the whole of mankind, the less it is possible to confine its outlook to the synagogue. Thus, the more the Jew is a Jew, the more universalist will be his views and aspirations, and the less aloof will he be from art or science, culture or education, and the more joyfully will he applaud whenever he sees truth and justice and peace and the ennoblement of man.
Excellent. So there's a lot of beautiful ideas here, but one of the ideas that he's doing is he's living in Germany where everyone's, not everyone, but a lot of Jews are assimilating and saying there's no value in Judaism anymore, but there's value in the theater. And his statement is, if the rabbis are going to say the theater is forbidden, everything can be found in the Talmud. Rabbi Hirsch would say, yes, everything can be found in the Talmud, but if that's true, then the Talmud should be able to engage with theater. Jews should be able to create art, create music, and engage with the art and music that's there and understand it through a Torah lens. If you're going to create a mechitza, a complete and total divide between the rest of the world and Judaism, then it means, or it looks like, it'll appear like Torah is lacking. And that's a really key thing here. If you were to ask Rabbi Hirsch, and I can't speak for him, but if you said, Rabbi Hirsch, would you be happy just sitting and learning Torah all day long? He might say, I would. But the world we live in, you need to be able to expand Torah into other areas, to be in conversation with science and literature and art. And not just that you're writing Jewish books that are literature, but that you can look at a work of Charles Dickens and take out of it the Jewish values, or look at it through a Jewish lens and either criticize it or enhance it, whatever that may be. Judaism needs to be able to respond and be in dialogue with the rest of the world. That's essentially modern orthodoxy, is that post the Enlightenment, Judaism can either totally separate from the world or it can engage with it. And while Torah is still the most important thing, and Jewish law above all. So for example, seeing a Shakespearean play is fine, but not on Shabbos. Seeing a musical is great if only men are singing. You know, I'm putting aside the issue of women singing, et cetera, but those are the kinds of conversations. Going to, to a party where they're playing music might be okay, but don't eat the shrimp there. Modern Orthodoxy says engage with the world, but through the lens of Torah. Shop at Kohl's. That's not an example of a trendy store. Shop at any store. It doesn't have to be a Torah store, but make sure your clothes don't have forbidden wool and linen mixers, shatnez. And he actually says that very beautiful about that balance and that prioritizing in source number 4. And Ken, did you disappear? No, Ken is there. Ken, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, excellent. Ken, if you will take source number 4. And again, this is originally in the German. This is from Rabbi Hirsch's commentary on Dvarim. But he continues, a lot of his philosophy is snuck into his Torah commentary. So Ken, please.
The study of the Torah shall be our main intellectual pursuit. We are not to study Torah from the standpoint of another science or for the sake of that science. So too, we are to be careful not to introduce into the sphere of Torah foreign ideas. Rather, we should always be mindful of the superiority of the Torah, which differs from all other scientific knowledge to its divine origin. Our sages do not demand of us to completely ignore all scientific knowledge, but rather that a person be familiar with these other realms of knowledge, but only from the Torah's perspective. And they warn us that neglecting this perspective will jeopardize our intellectual life.
Excellent, thank you. Now, it would be much, much easier to only read books that have been given a rabbinic seal of approval. Everything in here is kosher. Everything is 100% Jewish, Torah, and consistent with our tradition. It is much harder to say, go read a book of Mark Twain and make sure that when there are things that are inconsistent with Jewish philosophy, that you understand where he's coming from, take out the good parts and ignore the bad parts. That requires a lot of work. Rabbi Hirsch's point is you need to do that work, because if you don't, not only are you missing a lot of the world, and we'll actually see that idea in some of the last sources I bring, but also people are doing that anyways. And in fact, in the next source, Rav Moshe is going to make that point. People are going to university. So if you say to them, all of this knowledge is forbidden, you're a bunch of heretics, they're going to say, well, I guess I'm getting no help or guidance from you. I'm on my own. This is true about many sex education. When children are given something which parents feel are icky and uncomfortable, but if they're given that education, they'll be much healthier when they approach physical relationships with other people. But if they're told it's evil and dark, then they're going to have a very unhealthy understanding of it. And when they're exposed to something that they've never been taught about before, they're often going to make bad decisions and judge themselves. It's going to be really messy. But if the rabbis say, look, you're going to engage with the secular world, and here's how you do it. And when you see something beautiful in science, don't say, wow, that scientist is incredible. I mean, you can say they're incredible, but recognize they were given a gift from God. everything we discover about the beauty, nature, and order of the universe is because God put that beauty and order there. Again, that requires extra effort, but the results, A, we need them because secular education is everywhere, and B, if one does it right, their understanding of the Torah and the rest of the world will be so much richer. As the Vilna Gaon said earlier, if you only study 1/10 of knowledge, then you're only accessing 1/10 of the knowledge that God put in this world. You need to study everything with the understanding that it is a gift from God, and Torah for Jews is the most important thing of all. Now, not all rabbis agree with that. There are a few rabbis, a former rabbi in Israel, Rabbi Elazar Shach, who is completely opposed to it. But when you start reading their reasons for it, they don't necessarily say that secular education is evil. Their concerns are being assimilated, being influenced by non-Jewish students at the universities, because our tradition, for the most part, sees secular education as valuable. So they have to come up with other reasons why going to university is bad. And those reasons have some value and have some truth, but they're not, the end all be all. One can go to a university and keep kosher and be part of a Jewish group and go to synagogue and learn history and science and learn other languages. So the rabbis who are completely opposed to it, it's not about whether university is fundamentally good or bad. These are the rabbis who have chosen to completely reject the modern world and say that there's no value in it and it'll only lead one astray. Sometimes yes, most cases no. And in fact, generally, that line of thinking that everything in the world that's not Jewish is evil is much more dangerous, because we're all going to get exposed to it. And if a student hasn't been prepared for it, it might actually mess them up. The rabbis say, don't ever listen to secular music because it'll mess up your mind. Or they could say, let's talk about it, let's educate, let's prepare you for it. And if they do, they'll be able to deal with secular education music beautifully. But if they don't, they'll mess them up even more by telling them how evil and forbidden it is. So Rav Moshe Feinstein in the 20th century was asked about kids going to university. His question was unique. It was actually students that study at yeshiva all year, but on summer vacation, when there's no yeshiva, can they do summer school and get a Torah education? And his answer, again, you got to read between the lines, because unlike Rabbi Elazar Shach and a few others, he doesn't say university is evil and forbidden. He says it's complicated. And well, I'll see who hasn't read in a while. I'll go ahead and take this one. So Rav Moshe says, that's all. In the matter of university studies, the issue is not simple. But for those who will end up going, we shouldn't protest too much, because it's known that protesting simply won't work. This is probably the most brilliant thing he says his entire piece. You tell a kid not to do something, they're going to do it anyways. And again, that shows a sensitivity and understanding to the reality. A lot of rabbis do not have that. They're locked away and they live in a cloistered world and ignore what's really happening. Rav Moshe lived in the real world in a very beautiful way. It won't work with most students, either because of parental pressure. I guess if my kids, don't want to go to university, that's going to be quite a fight because we want them to go to college, or because they're going to learn a trade, which we've seen a lot of rabbis say that's fine to learn a living so they can earn a living, or because they aren't learning Torah anyways. And the fact that he recognizes that there are students who just aren't going to yeshiva, so they're going to go to university. He says, well, it's not so simple, but ultimately they're going to go anyway, so don't give them such a hard time. But here's the thing. When he brings up some of the issues, he doesn't say secular education will mislead you or it's bad and physics are bad. His issue is very specific. He says one major issue is that at the college campuses, there are women who go about dressed inappropriately, and they will cause the students to have inappropriate thoughts. Okay, fine. So don't have inappropriate thoughts. Only go to winter school where everyone's covered up anyways. But again, his issue is not with university education. It's not with learning art, literature, or sciences. It's with being surrounded by inappropriateness, which, by the way, again, there's a lot of truth to that. In college, many kids are exploring their bodies and they have relationships. And for an Orthodox kid to be exposed to that, it might be challenging for them. However, what could be more damaging is to pretend that that doesn't exist and to tell them that women don't exist until the day they get married. And then if they ever accidentally get exposed, their brains will explode. Rather, to raise a child to be sensitive to these issues, to have a healthy relationship with the opposite sex and to understand what an appropriate relationship will look like so they can have a healthy one, instead of cramming it down their throats and saying, if you ever do anything against our tradition, you'll burn for it. That doesn't work. Rav Moshe knew that. And he said, look, college isn't good for, and by the way, in the rest of the article, he says to these Rosh Yeshiva, to these students who will listen to him, you really should tell them not to go to university. For these students who are the B'nai Torah, the ones who really are, they want to live a life of, that totally cloistered life, don't send them to college. Certainly don't encourage it. Tell them they can't go. So Rav Moshe often speaks to two different groups. He speaks to one group who doesn't care about this university anyways, and then he speaks to the rest of the world. But ultimately, he doesn't say it's forbidden. There's a place for it, and he recognized that. Then you get to a little bit later in the 20th century, and you have teachers like actually Rav Kook in Israel, but in America you have Rav Soloveitchik and one of his students, Rabbi Norman Lamb, who is the president and chancellor of Yeshiva University, which has a dual education. It has a Torah education and a secular education as well. Rabbi Norman Lamb passed away, I think it was only 2 years ago, and he was writing here reflecting the teaching of his teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik. And he says in his work, Torah Umada, Torah, faith, religious learning on one side, and Mada, which is the word for like knowledge or in general, science, worldly knowledge on the other, together offer us a more overarching and truer vision than either one set alone. Each set gives one view of the Creator as well as of his creation, and the other a different perspective that may not agree at all with the first. Each alone is true, but only partially true. Both together present the possibility of a larger truth. So what we've seen is going back all the way to the Talmud, and many rabbis throughout history, from the greats Maimonides, Ramban, Maharal, Vilna Gaon, is that secular education is not just it's okay only when you're trying to get a job. It has fundamental value. It's not as important as Torah. Torah is the greatest value, the gift given from God. But to truly unlock the Torah and to appreciate God's universe and God's world, we need to be able to access the other tools. And there is a value in science, arts, and literature in and of themselves because it allows us to appreciate and understand the world we are living in. And because of that, university is an appropriate place for Jews to go to study and understand the world. Now, at the same time, they should be studying real Torah. If they're going to take a break, not go to yeshiva, not study in Israel, because they're just going to college, that might be problematic. They need to make sure that they are always, while they're studying secular education, they're also not neglecting Bitul Torah. They're not neglecting Torah studies, whether they're learning on their own or getting a major in Jewish studies and Yiddish and Hebrew, etc. It needs to be a mixture. They are intertwined, as Rabbi Lamb says. They're two different parts of a greater whole. So university is great, ideal, valuable. Not that Jews must go, but it's absolutely worthwhile as long as Torah is included in it. And there are some issues with living a rich Jewish life, being exposed to ideas that might challenge one's observance, but those are going to happen whether or not one goes to university. And the point is that parents and educators need to prepare children for the real world, because if they cloister them away, they're going to find it anyways. And when they do find it, it's going to be in an unhealthy, damaging way. But if we engage with the world through the lens of Torah and God, not only can it enhance our understanding of the world, but we can do it in a healthy way. So yes, Jews can go to university. There's an absolute value in it, as long as they are careful and think about what they're doing and why they're going, and keep in mind ultimately that everything they learn is in service of becoming a greater person, serving God and the Jewish community.